City administrations deal with multiple and competing needs from citizens, from guaranteeing the provision of basic public services, water and sanitation, waste management, energy, transport, to promoting economic development and maintaining public safety.
How then can a city effectively implement climate actions? One of the key steps to move from planning to implementation is to prioritize actions that will be the most impactful and beneficial to citizens.
The purpose of this subsection is to demonstrate how a city can prioritize climate actions considering its local needs and context. On this video, you will hear from expert Cassie Sutherland, C40 Managing Director of Climate Solutions and Networks, on why prioritizing action is important and some of the best tips for doing so.
Cassie, great to have you with us. In this section, we are looking at prioritizing climate actions in cities. So with so many competing priorities in city administrations, why should cities prioritize climate action?
It's a great question, and thanks very much for having me here, Matthias. Delighted to be joining this session. So climate action, I think, is important that it's not seen in a bubble, whether it's for cities or for national governments, that climate action must and can deliver multiple benefits. So it can deliver benefits, and we can talk about them further, across economic, social and environmental aspects of a city. We know that increasingly cities are facing the impacts of climate change, be it heat waves, be it flooding, be it water shortages and drought. And so taking climate action in order to protect citizens in those times of climate impact, but also to mitigate as much as possible those impacts getting worse and worse. So firstly, there's a need right on the doorstep of our cities, and more people are moving to cities and living in cities, so we know that that's the area where action's got to take. But then let's think about some of those benefits that can happen. There's some research that C40 did that looks at the climate actions that our 97 cities have all put in place and kind of committed to. And it says that around 50 million jobs could be created if those climate actions are accelerated. So the job creation potential is massive, and therefore the economic potential of climate action is massive. And also a number of those jobs are going to be created and delivered locally for people who live in cities and to help actually the things that are actually affecting cities the most. So we've got a direct economic benefit. I think we shouldn't forget about health and well-being. I think if we look at the impacts in our cities through COVID-19, things like the access to green space, high quality green space is no more important than it is right now, and the value is really being put on that. But also we know that green spaces and nature can help us mitigate some of those impacts of climate change. So we've got, again, a kind of social and well-being aspect. And then I think if we look at health even further, and we look at aspects such as toxic air and emissions and heavy pollutants from vehicles, from buildings, tackling those emissions from an air quality and climate perspective will improve the health of our residents. So I think it's really exploring all of those multiple benefits and actually seeing them as the entry point to climate action. They're not just a co-benefit, they're not just an and/or, it really is that's the heart of it. And actually we can design climate action to have the greatest improvements on economic well-being, health and well-being of our citizens.
So Cassie, tell me, how can cities prioritize climate actions? Can you give some guidance to cities that want to develop climate actions, but they don't know which ones to choose or how to select them?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's a huge challenge for our cities. And I think it is, while there's some key principles we can use to support cities and give them a framework for this, I think also it's very dependent on the city context. So we have what we call the ASAP tool at C40, the Action Selection and Prioritization tool, that looks at 4 main criteria to help that prioritization. One being mitigation potential, what's the proportion of emissions I'm going to save from this action? One being adaptation potential, how is this going to help me manage the impacts of climate change and the risk that I'm seeing in my city? The feasibility, can I do it? A crucial question for any of these actions. And then also the wider benefits. So be that on health, on well-being, on economics, on other social aspects and kind of indicators that the city is important for the city. So I think those 4 are good guiding principles, but as with anything, the real difficulty is in the detail of that, and I think also reflecting the current context of a city. So I talked before about city powers. I think that needs to be overlaid or very important in the feasibility part, and for a city to say, am I using something that I have in my disposal, my spatial development planning, my new land use plan I'm going to put out, my new code, or my procurement. If I'm going to use that, okay, I think that's the best way to really influence a wider market. That means it may not have the biggest emission saving or adaptation potential, but it's actually sending a strong signal across the city and even broader across a region that this is the direction in which we want to go. And that could be around, moving towards more walking and cycling infrastructure. It could be around purchasing healthier food that's more locally sourced, for example, and using procurement powers. It could be around reducing emissions from existing municipal buildings. So really using that to send a strong signal because you know it's going to have a wider impact and it's the stuff that's in your control. There may be other actions that may be prioritised on a very political basis. I mean, just we're sitting in London doing this interview, we'll see, huge gains made by the Mayor of London on the ultra-low emission zone, really focusing on getting the dirtiest cars out of the city. It was a very big and kind of purposeful choice to say that that was a public health and climate issue. And the Mayor of London used his political platform and voice, as well as his kind of legislative powers, to say, this is where I want this change to go. I want to improve the public health of residents in London, so therefore I'm going to get these dirty cars off the road. So I think it's also important that cities use what their kind of political context and the main drivers are that they have in their disposal at the moment.
Can you give some inspiring examples of cities, especially in the global south, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, that are doing things that are quite impressive in terms of climate action?
We are seeing some fantastic climate action. We're seeing the rollout of electric bus fleets right from Shenzhen in China to Bogota in Colombia, and we're really seeing huge influxes of technologies such as electric buses, which are transforming air quality and emissions in our cities. Tshwane in South Africa is the first city in Africa to develop a net zero carbon building code by 2030. So all buildings, new buildings in the city will be built to a net zero carbon standard by that point. Now, that's not only world leading in terms of Africa and African cities, it is pretty world leading, to be honest. That is going above, beyond many of our kind of American or European cities as well.
Is that doable?
Yeah, it's totally doable. I mean, you need to make sure that you're having consultation with the whole supply chain, with designers, with architects, with developers, but it's totally possible to do. We now know in most cases what the solutions are. It's actually making them happen. So for net zero carbon building codes, it's going from fabric energy efficiency. How do I insulate this building? How do I ensure it doesn't have a high requirement for heating or cooling? And then any demand I've got left, let me put renewables in to do that. The technologies are there, the solutions are there. It's about bringing an industry and kind of marketplace with us, but it's definitely possible.
And also in terms of bringing high impact, I mean, politicians and leaders are looking for things that will actually bring a lot of change on the ground. So could you give some examples or ideas of what's actually bringing a lot of change in the climate actions?
Yeah, so a good example, maybe again talking about the regions we're thinking of, is within Latin America we've been supporting a program called ZEBRA, which is a good name really, but it's a zero emission bus rapid accelerator. And that started with a premise that cities wanted to electrify some of their transport because that reduces emissions, carbon emissions, but also improves air quality and health. And often buses rely on really dirty diesel and it's horrible for people to be around. And so that's where the cities were pushing. They're saying, we want to do this, we want to look at this area. There was really a lack of buses. The electric buses didn't really exist in the market. So it was very difficult for that cities to send that signal to a market and a market to respond. So we have helped to support cities, a number of cities work on their procurement and using the power of city-led procurement to say, okay, if we start to require electric buses within this procurement and we use the collective power of cities to now bring in some of those e-bus or electric bus manufacturers into the market, will really have the supply and demand meeting each other in the middle. And this has led to huge change. We now have thousands of electric buses across our cities in Latin America, and we're starting to see that as the biggest growing market outside China for electric buses. So I think that's a great example of change on the ground, but also recognising that it's some city-led change using procurement, a city prioritising that action. Our session's about prioritising action. They've prioritised that, so have a number of other cities, so they work together to do it. They use the powers they have in procurement to then work with a whole other industry and sector to be able to deliver the change. And that's really, I think, the important nexus of climate action that requires that kind of multiple, inputs of change to make the difference.
Would you say also that it's important to understand what are the current policies and legislations in place so that climate action can be integrated into those policies and so that the policies have this kind of vision or a climate lens?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think some of those potential that we talked about before, of those looking at the mitigation, adaptation, feasibility and wider benefits, is a great framework to look at, because you can bring all departments in a city hall around those 4 areas. Particularly, I think the wider benefits are super important. We talked a bit about health and social benefits. You know, when you're looking at climate action that also has an air quality potential, we talk about reduced number of premature deaths. We talk about reduced number of emissions that are going to be the most harmful to health. These numbers and having this evidence base really speaks to health professionals and practitioners.
So
that's
an
a great way.
bus would actually reduce the costs in the health system.
Exactly. And you can say it's going to reduce in first preventing people from having to access healthcare, because it's going to improve their health there. But also, you know, it will actually help in terms of there being greater funding available for the health system when people go into it, because we know that it's delivering a co-benefit, and so that kind of leverages more money at the city level. So I think that's a really important argument, and the same with the economic benefits. We talked about job creation. I think really taking some of that evidence base, and we have a number of tools available through C40, through Urban Shift, that help cities to really quantify some of that evidence base and make those strong business cases internally. So what is it that your citizens or residents are facing now? Is it high prices for energy and food? Is it a lack of access to certain services in the city? Is it that they're having to travel an hour and a half to go anywhere across the city? You know, really kind of making the climate action link to solving those immediate issues that a city is facing brings a real rallying cry, I think, from voters, from residents, but also then that gets the attention of any politicians within the city.
Following this video, you will see several examples of cities that have prioritized and act boldly to bring impactful, inclusive, and viable actions. While you watch these examples, try to identify which climate actions could bring the most impacts to your city, considering 3 overarching themes. 1. Primary benefits, which are the mitigation and adaptation potential of actions. 2. The wider benefits, which are the social, economic, and more widespread benefits of actions. And 3, feasibility, which is the likelihood and potential of actions to be implemented in your city. We hope this section provides inspiring examples and great insights for you to start prioritizing and implementing relevant climate actions in your city.